everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going to be doing my September into October reading wrap-up. I am finally out of the reading slump I was in when I was actively drafting and editing my last YA thriller project, so I have just breezed through like 7 books in a relatively short period of time for me, including I'm finally reading some fiction again, though there's still some non-fiction here as well. It was also very hit or miss. I read some absolute bangers and then I read a couple that I just didn't love. But without further ado, let's dive into the books because I did have some thoughts about a few of these, and this might be a rambly reading wrap-up as usual because the first one I read was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. And if you watched my last reading wrap-up, you'll know that I had some thoughts about The Maidens, which is his second book, and so I thought I need to give this author a fair shake. I picked up his blockbuster bestseller, The Silent Patient, which was his debut thriller. I'll say overall, I did like this one a bit better. However, it fell into some of the same patterns that I found in The Maidens that bothered me in The Maidens, and I think perhaps this author really just isn't for me. That said, I think that there's a base level of skill and something to his writing that is incredibly compelling. I didn't have a problem reading through either of the books, but I just, at the end, was like, eh. So I will likely give him one more shot, but if he falls into the same patterns on the third one, probably just not going to bother again. So what's The Silent Patient about? It actually drew me in with a pretty great premise, and millions of other readers as well. Our main character is Theo, who is a therapist who's been fascinated for years with a very public case of this famous artist who allegedly murdered her music video director husband brutally in their home one night. But no one knows what happened or why she did it because she has not spoken a word since the night of the murder 7 years ago. Due to that, she has been committed to a facility, and Theo, basically, she's at the top of his bucket list, like that patient that he wants to get with and figure out and fix, so to speak. So he finds a way to get a job at this facility and sets himself the task of cracking Alicia, the silent patient. You go back and forth in time between Theo in the present working with Alicia and Alicia's diary from the past leading up to the murder of her husband. So it's that really fun back and forth thing I really tend to enjoy in thrillers where, like, because you have context of the present, you're like trying to piece together clues in the past, and I love especially when people from the past show up in the present. And this book does all of that really, really well. It was super readable, but non-spoilery, I can say one of the things, look, I'm all for suspension of disbelief, and we know that some trashy soapy stuff will happen in a good thriller where people might not necessarily act the most professionally. But this is the second book in a row of Michaelides where I'm just like, wow, the main character is a phenomenally bad therapist. So this has a lot of that, as did The Maiden. So if that also makes you kind of just like deep sigh to yourself where you're like, wow, I can't believe they're doing that. How are they getting away with that? This has a bit of that as well, though not as bad as The Maidens because there's no like police investigation that Theo is interfering with because everything happened in the deeper past. But he is going around and like talking to all of Alicia's friends and family and neighbors and stuff, trying to piece together what happened, and sometimes it stretches believability once or twice. It also leads to some loose threads, which I will get to later. Well, not so much loose. The thing that leads to is a slight spoiler. I will have a short spoiler section. And then the other thing that the book did that The Maidens did as well, it's a deep sigh moment, and again, a not for me thing necessarily. I think maybe he just has this habit of creating, they're like manic pixie dream girls, but they're more like obsessively devoted spouse every man in the book wants to hook up with syndrome instead of a manic pixie dream girl. He has a type. And in The Maidens it was Marina, and she was the main POV character, and you just had these moments of, girl, why are all these men stalking you? Don't you have a problem with this? But also, why is the book doing this? In this one, of course, it's Alicia, and I guess at least you're not in her point of view, but where it just kind of grates is, much like in The Maidens, in The Silent Patient, this female character doesn't have much of a personality, characteristics that you could really concretely say to another person beyond, she loves her dead husband a lot. It is part of the drive of the narrative, and every man in the book is interested in her sexually. Especially because Alicia is the silent patient. Like, you literally don't particularly get to know her, and even in the past diary entries, her whole world really revolves around her husband and how much she loves her husband. And of course, part of that mystery is like, so why did she kill him? And then you go from there. But it renders Alicia, much like it rendered Marina, slightly flat and frustrating, especially as a female reader. So briefly, I do want to talk about spoilers. I mean, this book is years old, but people might be curious. What are the specific reasons it didn't quite work for you? This basically just fell in the middle for me. So, spoilers. The same thing happened in The Silent Patient for me that happened with The Maidens, though thankfully not to the same degree, so this one does rate a little bit higher for me. It was overall a better experience. But in both cases, we get to the big plot twist, and it renders 80% of what came before completely moot, and it feels like cheating. It robs the reader of a real sense of satisfaction because it means a bunch of the stuff that came before is meaningless. At least in The Maidens, the red herrings never actually felt like real threats because it was so obvious where the book was going. In this one, I do think that it was a lot better at having some convincing red herrings and executing the twist. It did kind of get me, like I caught up to it before it happened, but I was still pretty impressed with the twist. I mean, we're in spoilers, so I can say, you know, that Theo's POV is actually 2 different points in time, that, you know, his wife was cheating with her husband and he was involved in what happened with Alicia's husband. It's a good twist. It's pretty well done. However, because then, you know, the reason he's, you know, trying to crack Alicia is he wants to find out if she's going to like out him, betray him, get him in trouble, but he also genuinely wants to know what happened. But like, you think about all of basically the whole plot of the book, all of the points of investigation he did, all of the people he was talking to, he ultimately knew the solution. He knew that she did it. And so those don't work as red herrings in hindsight because you're like, oh, okay, oh. It's just a slight letdown. And so it seems to be a habit that he has, like he so works backwards from this big twist he has in his mind that is so incredible. It's just my thing as a reader, as much as I love a really good twist, I need a really good twist that doesn't invalidate everything that came before. I personally as a reader can feel really cheated by that kind of thing. And so I didn't hate this book, but it did kind of dip it a little bit for me because also we find out Alicia has no good reason to be silent other than a Greek metaphor. Didn't mention that in the non-spoiler section. He loves his Greek tragedy metaphors, and I really hope the next one doesn't do it because it's like, I know you have a brand, but it was a bit heavy-handed for me, and that's the thing. Her reason kind of sucks, and as a reader, it's disappointing. Because when you go into the book with this premise, I certainly did. Half of the guessing game for me was, is there a really good reason why Alicia is silent? I had all sorts of theories in my head, like wouldn't it be really cool if by some twist somehow she's not Alicia? Something. I was spinning crazy theories in my mind and none of it mattered because she didn't talk, because she felt her husband had symbolically killed her the same way her dad had symbolically killed her by basically disrespecting her. I guess psychologically that's slightly interesting, but I felt very disappointed. It's a promise of the premise thing for me, essentially, that it was such a big deal that Alicia's a silent patient and she won't talk and what's the reason? Then I was just kind of let down. And spoilers, but as I said, overall, definitely liked it better than The Maidens in terms of the reading experience, but overall, I do think that Alex Michaelides is an overhyped author who has some brand hallmarks that don't necessarily work for me personally as a reader. Next, I read Endless Night by Agatha Christie. This is kind of a funny one. It's all the funny ways that we come to books because I am a mood reader. So Haley Mills in her memoir talked about being in the movie for Endless Night in the 70s. It wasn't a Christie I had really heard of, and I mean, I guess now that I've read it, I'm not super surprised that we haven't seen more adaptations of it, but I was like, why is the only movie from the 70s? And all I can find of it is a trailer because she made it sound really interesting. I can't find the movie anywhere. And I watched the trailer, and the trailer is all like the biggest twist and shocks audiences. And I saw people in the comments of that YouTube video saying it's their favorite Agatha Christie novel, and it was so shocking. Anyway, it was on sale for like $2.99. I bought it, I read it. And I kind of came out of it lukewarm. And I did check with Mara, our resident Agatha Christie expert, and I was like, can you just like check me here? I knew that it wasn't her favorite either. I had watched her ranking Christie video as I was reading. I was like, oh, I'm so curious what Mara thinks of this one. And she agrees, and we kind of agreed on the reasons, and she gave me some better recommendations for Christie. I am honestly not as well read in Christie as I should be. I've really only read And Then There Were None, like a basic BITCH, so I need to read more Christie. So this is basically my second Christie. Very different from And Then There Were None. The thing about Endless Night, it is all predicated on this big twist. Was it a good twist? It's a pretty good twist. I don't mind how it was done either, and when I think of the novel in a whole, I absolutely see why it is a favorite for so many people. It does something pretty cool. That said, it does something that won't shock some thriller readers because we're reading it as a modern thriller reader, but I can see how when Christie did this, it was probably super groundbreaking. But that actually contributes to some of the issues that I had with it. Some of it's just stylistic, the way that you could write a book when Christie was writing books. Generally speaking, Agatha Christie books that I have looked at and read, because And Then There Were None also is dated in some ways, but it's great. But you go, oh, you can't write a book like this now. Styles have changed. This whole thing is like this rambling stream of consciousness narration by the main character, whose name of course I'm blanking on. The point is, it's this guy, he goes to this English town, he sees this like manor house on the hill, and it is set on a property. Look, I'm not gonna say the name, and this is where it gets sticky because I guess this is kind of why this is kind of fading into the background. The name of the property that is repeated repeatedly throughout the book, and a theme in the book, it's now considered a racial slur. So the Romani people, you know the word that I'm talking about. It starts with a G. It's G acre. So I will say Romani acre, but I mean the other one. That is the name of the house, or acre. I forget the exact name, but it's the G word. He wants to buy this property. It's like his dream house, and he has an architect friend that he met somewhere because he's a chauffeur and he does odd jobs all over Europe. He's like, I want him to build me my dream house. If only I were a rich man. And then he runs into a beautiful young American heiress who is also in this little hamlet and sees the property, and they fall in love and they get married, and it's this whole narration of like how her family doesn't want her to marry him and they have to do it in secret, and they use her governess to kind of like make this marriage happen, and you're like, okay. And then they go back and they want to buy the property, and there's an old woman there of the Romani people who warns them that the land is cursed and that anyone who buys it like befalls a terrible fate. That's what the previous family had happen. But they buy it, they tear down the house, they build their beautiful thing. And so I'm going on and you're like, what is this novel building up to? And that was my question too. I'm reading it, and that, what I just described to you, is more than 50% of the book. It's literally just this guy narrating how he came to be in this place, how he met Ellie, how they got married, after they got married, where they went on their honeymoon, and it goes on and on and on. So really, to talk about it, I will probably do another brief spoiler section, but my general thing is, pacing wise, this really, really drags. You're reading it and it does not feel like a suspense novel. If you approach it more as like a stream of consciousness piece of literary fiction, perhaps it can work a little bit better with a decent twist at the end. But it's really not a mystery. It's really not a suspense novel, barely. It does that thing I don't particularly like, but I know was very in vogue at the time, where the narrator keeps going, if only I knew then what I know now, in order to try to cheaply build suspense. Let's talk brief spoilers so you know, because you have to evaluate this book in the context of the twist, which makes it a tricky book in my opinion. So spoilers for Endless Night, a book that came out 50 or 60 years ago. Anyway, by Agatha Christie. So, the whole point of how the book is constructed, the whole twist, it's an unreliable narrator book. You find out at the climax, and I realized I could have theoretically said this in the non-spoiler section, except this is like the 70 or 80% point of the book. That's how weird the pacing is. Ellie dies. Ellie falls off her horse and dies. And you keep going and you keep going and you get to the climax, and there's this whole thing where he didn't like the governess. She rubbed him the wrong way. She was too possessive of Ellie and he felt threatened, and you go and you go. And the twist is that actually he met, I think her name is Greta, the beautiful Swedish governess. He met her in Europe years ago. They had this fabulous love affair. He said, if only I were a rich man. And she said, well, I could help you get rich. Let me introduce you to this American, this gullible American girl that I work for. You can marry her and then we'll kill her and we'll get all of her money. And that's the twist, that it was all fake, basically. But then he kills Greta too, because reasons, there is legitimately a reason in the book, and he gets caught, and it's this whole thing about how I guess the land was cursed and I am the curse, and it's called Endless Night because there's this song that Ellie sings on the guitar, and there's a line in it, something about day versus night, and the main character's like, I am endless night, and it's like a good versus evil kind of thing where you realize there's all this strain between him and his mother, and you realize it's because his mother sees him for what he is, which is essentially Agatha Christie wrote the secret sociopath, unreliable narrator trope in Endless Night. As I said, great payoff, but I kind of hate how we got there. I was bored a lot of the time. I kept going like, where is this going? It feels pedestrian. A lot of the narration and descriptions of what's happening. So don't put it at the top of your list if you're gonna read Christie. It's funny that it's the second one I read, but I plan on reading Death on the Nile and Crooked House. And I guess technically I should read Murder on the Orient Express. I was thinking, oh, I know how that one ends, so I shouldn't read it. But I know how Crooked House ends, and I still want to read it because I really like Crooked House. There's a great movie adaptation currently on Netflix of that one. But yeah, I feel like Endless Night just isn't the best Christie, but it does do some cool things with a cool twist. We're out of spoilers now, so I won't tell you what it is, but it is kind of cool. Next, in an attempt to clear my NetGalley queue, I read People Like Her by Ellergy Lloyd. I ended up really loving this book, but I cannot talk about it without honestly front-loading you with content warnings. This one gets rough. Basic premise is pretty cool. It is this mom influencer. This is a UK set suspense book. She is like the biggest mom influencer on Instagram. Her brand is called Mama Bear. She's got, I think she's a 4-year-old and then a newborn baby, and her whole life is this influencer mom brand. And you start out in her POV, and she's giving this speech at a meet and greet, and she's talking about the brand, and I was like, oh, I knew it was about an influencer mom, but I was like, is this the whole book? This voice is a lot. And then it goes dual POV. And the other POV is her jaded husband. And I actually loved his first chapter. It starts out bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. And it's him basically, everything she just said, it's him being like, this is what's actually true versus my dear wife's brand. So of course, this is domestic suspense essentially. If you can't tell, husband and wife, how her career is this double-edged sword. It single-handedly pays for everything they have, for their house, etc. It sustains them because he's a struggling novelist. We love a meta novelist. He had a book come out like 7 years ago and it bombed, and he's been struggling to write a follow-up novel since, and he's convinced his agent doesn't like him and his editor is bored, and that people only want to talk to him to get to his wife because she's super famous, and it is like, if you like the BS of influencers and you want like an influencer social thriller, it delivers on that. It has some delicious, ultimately satire of the whole thing. It has a very clear POV that's pretty harsh. I enjoyed it. on the whole thing, though it shows both sides in the sense that like you really see like all of the hate comments and death threats that a lot of people do get, and just like how people criticize parents, especially on social media, especially moms, like mom shaming. It goes into all of those themes. But we also have a third POV, and this is where we have to get into content warnings. 100% do not read this book if you have any issues at all with baby in danger. There is a subplot with baby in danger, and also it mentions instances in the past with related characters of miscarriage as well as infant death. It is heavy in terms of those as themes, and it is pretty inescapable reading the book, so just don't pick it up if those are issues for you. I was pretty shocked where it went. I was fine to read it, of course I got through it, but I was still like, dang book. So the third POV, it's that type where you don't actually know who it is until much later in the book, and it kind of comes in and you know that it's a person who really hates Emmy, the mom, hates her passionately and wants to get revenge against her for something, and she is stalking her. And like, so the early parts are them dissecting things that Emmy says and does to try to find out where Emmy lives. And so it's this lurking threat over the first part of the book. And you're like, okay, what did Emmy do? And you know that Emmy is a slightly messy person, so you can only imagine. And where I will briefly give slightly more in-depth spoilers for those who heard the content warning and need to know a little bit more concrete info, it does relate to this POV, so brief spoilers here. This POV had a daughter who committed suicide after her infant child died as she was co-sleeping, and Emmy had advised this person through a DM on Instagram that co-sleeping was great, and the mom POV character, this third POV, later saw an interview where Emmy is like, I would never co-sleep, that's too dangerous, and she's like, she is a hypocrite and a liar, and she killed my daughter and my granddaughter is her logic. She hashes this fully bonkers plot, and this is where it's really content warning. First, you get a description of when she found her infant grandchild dead. It's a lot. And then part of her plot against Emmy is to kill her infant son. This book gets really, really dark. So that end spoiler tag of basically how those content warnings come into play. And honestly, I really liked this book. As dark and hard as it got, I was kept on my toes. I loved the interplay of the POVs, though I of course was the most uncomfortable in that third POV, but there were some good like subplots and mysteries that really engaged me, that kept me guessing, just the dynamics between the husband and the wife. And then it has a pretty good subversion ending. Like, it's got an epilogue that made me raise my eyebrows a bit and ultimately left me with a pretty good like post-book feeling. It really scratched the itch of the adult thriller based in the world of social media influencing, specifically like mommy bloggers, though this is all about Instagram, and like kind of the conflicts within the marriage, the face we show to the world versus what is reality, murky morality and ethics. Emmy is kind of not a good person, but there are also moments where you understand why she is the way she is, and then it's like, you know why her husband loves her, and he's not perfect either. And it was lovely and messy. A really, really good domestic suspense book with a social influencer kind of twist to it. But bear in mind the content warnings, they are legit. Next, I read 10 by Gretchen McNeil. This came out, I believe, in 2012, so it is an older YA thriller, and I read it because I want to write an isolation trope YA thriller, and there aren't many. I'd say this is the biggest title that comes up over and over again. And I can definitely see why it comes up over and over again, why it got a Lifetime movie, which I haven't seen and I've been trying to track down, but I don't want to subscribe to the Lifetime streaming service. That said, it really fell in the middle for me, which is nothing on the book, but more, I'm not the target reader for this book, and that is completely okay in that it has a very classic YA feel. So if you have been looking for a book that I mean, it was published in 2012 and it feels like it was published in 2012. The characters don't curse, for example, which really threw me off. I'm just so used to current day YA. So I got really emotionally engaged in the book and in the characters, and there was this one specific climax scene where I was so angry on behalf of the main character, and I wanted to hiss and spit and curse. And I love when a book gives you that feeling, by the way. That is such a sign of emotional attachment, engagement in a book, where you get to, there's always a good blow up scene in a good book like this, and you are indignant on the main character's behalf and you want to shout obscenities at the other person. And they were just saying like the harshest word used was crap. And I just wanted to fling obscenities, and I was like, oh, it is a perfect lower YA mystery slash thriller. And that's the thing, it's this weird dichotomy between people die in this book. There's a lot of death in this book. This is essentially a modernization, a YA modernization of And Then There Were None. It's a bunch of teens on an island off the coast of Seattle. Someone has a revenge plan and starts knocking them off, and it's a race to the finish to figure out who is doing this and why and how to survive. And as the title indicates, there are 10 of them, just like there were 10 in And Then There Were None, and most of them die. That's not a spoiler. It is just like And Then There Were None. So people are dying and the deaths are serious. Some of them are pretty gruesome, actually. But it has a very light hand. You could totally give this to a 12 or 13-year-old, provided they're pretty mature, and there wouldn't be any issues with it, because it doesn't really have that like hard R content that I've become super accustomed to seeing in YA thrillers. It's actually kind of fun to see the progression of YA, though you know I have feelings about how much we push it to the upper ends of crossover, and I'm literally guilty of participating in this because of the types of thrillers that I write. But it was a really interesting read for me. But in parts, I was frustrated because it was this weird, all the characters felt very safe and nice, even though they'd technically done bad things, but the bad things were bad, but not as bad as you would expect. Because I think now we really turn that dial way, way up. We go a lot further with how terrible we'll make characters in a YA book who are teenagers and the things we'll do to them. I mean, they do die, as I said. And so it was just, it was really, really interesting. But this one is really perfect for like middle school and young high school readers who want like something that's a little edgy and gory because there's so many deaths, but it kind of sits in that safe, pure, or I said lower YA, it's really like what I call a pure YA space, the way that YA used to feel. It had some good twists and turns. Some things were very obvious to me because I'm a jaded, older adult thriller reader specifically, and I'm familiar with it, and there were none. Some of them got me though, and I was pretty impressed. I was convinced halfway through, I was like, I know exactly what this book is doing. And then it didn't do exactly that, and that is good. I do have one content warning for this one that I do think is important to share, and that is about the depiction of mental health. I'm not 100% sure it's the greatest. Mostly my content warning is it's going to, as always, depend on your personal feelings and barometer for how mental health is used in young adult, in suspense, and in thriller. And specifically, if you are a person who has or is more sensitive to depictions specifically of borderline or bipolar disorder, I don't love some of the things that this book does. I'll have to say this briefly with spoilers, and so if this is a content warning that you are also like, it interests you and you're wary of, I do think it is worth hearing these spoilers. Essentially, our main character has a really rocky relationship with her best friend, and it's made clear that her best friend has serious mental health issues. It never says what they are, but my read on it was either bipolar disorder or possibly borderline personality disorder, as much as you can arbitrarily diagnose a fictional character. Might be bipolar though, because the character is medicated, and there is an aspect of the plot line that is pretty ableist in the sense that there is a subplot of someone having sabotaged that character's medication so that they fly off the handle. They are basically coming off of their meds or off their meds during this weekend to make them appear more guilty. Basically, this character functions as a red herring character because she is not okay. She's not doing well, and of course there's the stress of all these people dying, and so she's reacting in a very extreme way, and it's playing off of already established difficult dynamics in her best friendship with the main character. So a lot of the conflict is derived from, I can't like this boy because my best friend likes this boy and she'll hate me, and I want to go away to college because I can't be in this suffocating friendship anymore. So it has those kinds of levels to it that can be very, very uncomfortable and are difficult to manage. But then it's coupled with the she's off her meds thing. And then because this is a full-on spoiler, it is an and then there were none plot. Almost everyone dies. The character with the mental health concerns, who is essentially really a victim in this story because her meds have been tampered with, she dies. And there's this one line at the end that I went, where it kind of misses the levity a bit, where the main character remarks, because the survivors are her and the boy she likes, that it was all worth it to end up with him. And I'm like, your best friend died? So did a lot of other people? This is not great, kid. This is not great. And this is, I mean, this is full spoilers, because now you know the boyfriend didn't do it, because they play off of that red herring as well. So I just felt reading it, and I say this as someone who has friends who have specifically bipolar disorder, that I would feel very uncomfortable reading that depiction if it were me, because you're in the main character's POV and lens seeing this other character, and the character is just put in the position of being an antagonist over and over again, and it is slightly uncomfortable. And of course I am reading this with like a 10-year on modern lens, and I think it's a lot easier to pick out some of these things now than it might have been then. I don't think it's like a black mark against the book, just a content warning, because some readers, it's really just not going to work for them. Next, I read The Push by Ashley Audrain. This is the theme of, I read a lot of difficult books this month, like books with very heavy stuff in them. This is another one that has to come right up front with a content warning, and it's not actually a spoiler. It is revealed if you read the blurb for the book, which is good because I think you should know going in. This is another book that it has to do with child death. Child death is an aspect of this book. This book is tricky to describe. It has a very literary upmarket feel, and you see it in the way that it's told. It's primarily in like, it's second person, but it's directed second person. So she is writing a letter of like confession or explanation to her ex-husband. And you know that from the first chapter. She's watching her husband with his new family, with his new wife and his new baby and their daughter at Christmas, and watching through the windows, and you get like a snapshot of like, how, you know, there's a bitterness there, and she gets to the end and she's like, but I have to tell you my side. And then the rest of it is she's addressing her husband as you, his name is Fox, her name is Blythe, but she's walking him through, us through, from the genesis of their relationship to the birth of their daughter, and what she feels in her bones is the truth. But even she starts to doubt herself, and that is that something is wrong with their daughter Violet. She felt it from the day that she was born. Something's off, something's wrong, and then something tragic happened years ago to their son, her second child, and she's convinced Violet did something. This is intercut with little like third person narrative snippets of, you're basically getting a generational portrait of bad mothers. The legacy that Blythe has inherited that cast doubt onto how Blythe comes to motherhood, specifically motherhood of a daughter. You get her grandmother, who has a lot of concerning traits generally, and especially concerning her daughter. And eventually her grandmother committed suicide when her daughter, the main character's mother, was 12. And then you get her mother's childhood into adulthood. And you know that she walked out on Blythe when Blythe was about the same age, and it's this legacy of this mothers and daughters. The mothers in their early 30s after being abusive mothers stop being mothers either by means of self-harm or just walking away, and kind of the psychic scars that that leaves generationally. And so you know that Blythe is coming to her marriage and to motherhood with a lot of baggage. These questions of why her mother didn't love her, and is it because her mother's mother didn't love her, didn't want her? And so you have these questions of how much is this, could it be postpartum depression, is definitely a narrative question that you get, and it has this, you're reading it the whole time going, is this an unreliable narrator? And I'm not going to tell you if it's an unreliable narrator, but I'll tell you that I was riveted. Absolutely riveted. It is a fantastic psychological suspense because you are constantly second guessing things, and the main character truly loses herself. Blythe loses herself to grief and obsession, and she tumbles down these rabbit holes and she does things and she's narrating it, and you're like, why are you doing this? And indeed things that don't really help her case, but you as the reader are also trying to dissect. You're like, who is right here? Is Blythe correct or is Fox correct? Who is Violet? We're only getting it through Blythe's lens. So what is the truth? What happened to her infant son? Actually, it's a really good book, but it's very dark. I actually picked it up because I watched a live stream with Kara Thomas, Courtney Summers, and Jessica Goodman, and they were raving about this book and how messed up it was. I was like, well, if they say this is a good messed up thriller, I have to read it. So I got it from the library, and yeah, it's very unsettling, but I found it incredibly satisfying. It scratched an itch. It's exactly the kind of messed up adult psychological thriller I really enjoy. But as I said, it handles pretty heavy topics of motherhood, so you have to know that you are going in like up front. You know that there is a child who dies in the book, and a lot of this book is about grief and related to that. Next, and we're just ping-ponging back and forth between books that were home runs for me and books that fell in the middle for me. So if you're keeping track, I loved People Like Her and I loved The Bush. I was a bit lukewarm on Shiver by Allie Reynolds. Another one I picked up because it's really buzzy and people have talked a lot about it. And specifically, my friend Laura Cadner did a video on like underappreciated thrillers, like thrillers she thought should get more hype. I had already checked this out from the library, but then she included this and I was like, okay, double reason to read it right away. And it fell a little flat for me. But it's still an isolation trope thriller set in the snowy Alps, and so it scratched a particular itch. And so I do recommend it if you also like isolation trope thrillers. It's not necessarily a bad one, but it's both not exactly what I was expecting, and it just does a few things at the climax, which I will discuss briefly with spoilers in a bit, that it sits in the middle for me. That's all. It was not a bad book. And parts of it I really, really enjoyed. And that actually is, this is about competitive snowboarders or former competitive snowboarders. So you know that they're reuniting at this chalet in the Alps 10 years after there was a horrible accident. And the question from that horrible accident is whether Saskia died or not. They never found Saskia's body. And the way that it is, if you fall into a crevasse on a glacier, they'll either find your body in 5 years or 10 years or 20 or 50 years. They'll never find your body. Or did you die? No one saw it happen. All we know is that Saskia disappeared, but there are like little clues. Like her credit card did see some use after her disappearance, and Saskia was, you go back and forth between the present, which is this creepy reunion where the reader, the seasoned reader of Isolation Trope immediately knows that something is wrong. And the book, pacing wise, dives right in. They literally arrive and go right into the first creepy thing that happens. Very good pacing wise. It was a fast, brisk read. And you go to the past, which is 10 years ago. The main character is like, this is her big season to prove herself. She's the underdog. She doesn't come from privilege, and she really has to make her name in snowboarding and earn her sponsors so she can afford the sport that she loves. And Saskia is, of course, the rich bitch. She's a classic rich bitch character, but she's kind of fun. Mila, the main character, and Saskia are fiercely competitive rivals. They do terrible things to each other. Saskia usually starts it, but Mila gives right back, and you get this really interesting tension in the past. You're getting to know this cast of characters. You know, some of them are in the present at the reunion and some aren't, and you're basically like, the narrative thriller question of the book is Saskia dead? If not, is she basically taking revenge on these people, bringing them back to this place and like taunting them with these horrible secrets? Or if Saskia is dead, one of them did it, who has brought them here? Is it one of them? And you're playing that kind of game. Where I was mildly surprised, this is not one of those isolation trip thrillers where you get a death right away and it's like the ticking clock of who's gonna die next. It's far more like, someone brought us here, we don't know why, we're trapped, how do we get away, with like suspecting each other all along. There is eventually an escalation of stakes, but I honestly did expect it to be like a murdery isolation trip thriller, and that comes much later, so bear that in mind. And to that end, I say slow building suspense, but it does have good pacing. It has some really great creepy elements. The setting works incredibly well. I did generally care for the characters, though this is very, very heavy on romantic personal stakes. Like, a huge thing about it is 10 years ago, Mila, she really wanted to hook up with Saskia's hot brother, but he intimidated her or something like that. So instead she hooked up with Brent, who was the younger, like young hot model, but less intimidating. And they hooked up all ski season. And there was this romantic tension between her and Saskia's brother. And now they're back on the mountain. And she hasn't seen any of these people in 10 years, and she still really wants to hook up with the brother, but she's not sure if he killed his own sister. And so you get that kind of tension, or whether Brent did it. And a lot of it is basically love triangle romance stakes. I like that kind of thing, but I could see where it would annoy some readers. It is an overwhelming part of the narrative, like who is hooking up with whom, who is cheating on who has fifis for whom, and who is she crawling into bed with. There's some little sexy scenes. The romance is definitely a central part of the plot. I definitely liked that Shiver kept me guessing, especially as I kept waiting for someone to die and it didn't happen, and I realized that this book wasn't going to be structured that way, which actually helped keep the suspense going in the sense that it's a very small cast. There's only 5 of them, and you're like, well, it's not the main character, so that only leaves 4 people. So it's actually kind of good they stay alive for a decently long time so that you can continue suspecting them. They all have secrets, and she's kind of poking around and trying to figure out what happened. And I loved the ping-ponging between present and past. I honestly almost loved the past more than the present, because all of the stuff with the competitive snowboarding was really, really interesting. That said, asterisk, one thing about this book that kind of got me, the author both simultaneously effortlessly immerses you in this world, regardless of whether you're familiar with competitive sports or skiing or snowboarding. However, there's a lot of shorthand that is used. And I know that, of course, if you have a main character who's immersed in the world, they're going to use shorthand, and it could be weird to explain things. And yet I did have some problems grokking some of specifically the visuals in this book. And there were places where you know that feeling when you're reading and you lose a visual sense of place, where you can't see what's happening because the narrative skips over something, or you don't understand what something is or would look like. That's me with every single snowboarding trick described in this book. I can kind of see the half pipe thing. I've literally never watched snowboarding in my life, but she names tricks that I don't understand. Sometimes she'll explain the actual body movements of something, and those scenes are easier to grok to, but there are definitely places where it skims a little on the visual details, and I really wish it had had a little bit more. But it almost didn't matter. I felt the competition. I felt the high stakes. I was in the world of the ski chalets and the bars and like the cozy fires, and I loved all of that stuff. That said, let's talk about my overall thoughts for the book briefly before spoilers. Essentially for me, the third act is kind of where it lost it for me. It wasn't bad. It's definitely a banger of a third act, as I like to say. It's very high octane. It just didn't personally do what I wanted it to do, or it didn't. It's just a personal thing where it made some choices that I'm going to talk about in spoilers. That said, it has an epilogue that I adored. It really brings it back for the epilogue. Like, so like the end is excellent, and I really liked it. There was just this stretch of the climax where it got, I can say non-spoilery, this is so random. If you have ever seen a French film from the early 2000s called The Crimson Rivers, it gave me those vibes. Like this very like soap opera dial turned up French noir. That's kind of how it felt. And of course it's set in the French Alps, but tonally it was a little bit jarring for me. I think that's the best way to put it. So, brief spoilers. Essentially, the problem is once you were completely sure that Saskia died, and you do get to that point eventually, there are suddenly very few potential solutions for the mystery. And there are several clues that make it very clear it's definitely a woman. But once you know it's not Saskia, that leaves very few possibilities. And you quickly also go, well, it's also not Heather. Heather is kind of ruled out the process of elimination. So you go, okay, what girls were in the cast 10 years ago? And in the past, the narrative does go down a surprise bisexual / lesbian route with Saskia, Mila, and Saskia's girlfriend, Odette. And you also know from earlier, Odette suffers a debilitating injury at the end of the season 10 years ago and ends up becoming paralyzed. And my brain goes, well, I wonder if this book is doing that thing where actually she's not paralyzed and she's the bad guy. Ding, 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 ding. And just that she was French, that it's all like revenge for her fallen lover. It just feels like a trope. I feel like it's something we see specifically in a certain kind of soapy noir. The like lesbian lover, secret lesbian lover out for revenge. And the paralysis fake out, you combine those two things, which are kind of tropey and soapy, with her villain monologue. It's the way that it was executed. Her villain monologue is intense. And this is the tone thing I was talking about. Just all of a sudden, it literally reminded me of a movie. And if you haven't seen The Crimson Rivers, the third act is next level like noir soap. And that's what this did, where she has this really dramatic villain monologue. And I just had this moment, I was reading it and I just kind of dramatically exhaled and I was like, oh, this is what the book is. It's just no longer my favorite. Really personal taste. I just was like, I love a good soapy ending, but I'm kind of bummed that it was the fake paralysis angry ex-lover route. And if it had been a dude, it would have sucked too. If it had been a dude being like, my girlfriend, it still would have felt really soapy. But it feels like a very particular trope that they do with women. Whether the woman is in a same-sex relationship or not, where it's like the woman getting revenge with her like big monologue. It's a trope that's not, we know this, it's simply not my favorite trope because ex-lover revenge. That is not one of my favorite tropes in thrillers, and this basically does that. Especially when it's a woman. There's something about like, I think what gets me is that a lot of writers use it as the shortcut of they were irrational and acting crazy because love, and it's not my favorite. But if you have read it and you're still in the spoiler section, yeah, wasn't the very last line in the epilogue kind of amazing? I do like thematically where this went in terms of like the places that competition and ambition will take you. You know, that's a theme that I really like. So I really did like that for the ending. And also the way that Saskia dies is pretty unsettling, and I did like that kind of double twist there. I liked both of those things. I was just way less enamored with the whole Odette reveal. End spoilers. And moving on to the last book I read, you know, on a mountain kick, I read The Next Everest by Jim Davidson, nonfiction. This is about 2015. There was an earthquake and an avalanche on Everest, and Jim Davidson was on the mountain, on the glacier at the time. And this is his memoir of being on Everest when there was a 7.8 earthquake, avalanches, people died, having to evacuate from Everest before he was able to climb it, and then his journey to go back to Everest and actually summit. I fell kind of in the middle on this one again, and this is mostly a comparison game problem. I'm a massive fan of Into Thin Air. It is one of my favorite books. It's one of the rare nonfiction books I have read more than once. I first read it in college, and then I read it again a few years ago. I think I might have gotten into one of my wrap-ups, and every once in a while, like, I just want to reread it. I might read it again now that I've read this, and I've read most of the other books about that same disaster, which was the 1996 Everest disaster. And this one, I didn't know what to expect going in. I actually saw this at the bookstore a few months ago. I went, oh, there's a new Everest book. And I knew that some stuff had gone on in Everest a few years ago. I didn't track it too closely. And I got it from the library. And it's not the book's fault that it didn't meet my high bar / expectations, but it's worth telling you what those were and why it didn't quite meet them, but why it was still a decent reading experience if you were interested in this subject, kind of. I think my thing with Jon Krakauer and why the bar is so high for me, but I got this out of the other ones I read as well. I don't just want a memoir when I read something like this. I want something more than a memoir. I want there to be like thematic substance and like social commentary or political commentary or whatever the flavor of the memoir is. Unless it's a celebrity memoir, which is a different bar. And what is so interesting about Into Thin Air is that so much of it is Jon Krakauer was a journalist, and there was a lot of analysis in that book, like really going over the event and like from all angles and what ifs and like the conditions and what led to what. And there was some commentary on the whole thing, that rich Westerners paying tens of thousands of dollars, like more like $70,000 to climb this thing, and some of the entitlement and all of, there's a lot of, it's a complex issue. And in fact, this book having not quite satisfied me, I went searching for one that would give me that, and I found one, and I have a hold at the library. So I'm very, very excited because I find that stuff really interesting. And what is really glaring in Davidson's memoir, it's a little myopic at times. He both will sometimes acknowledge his privilege and the bizarreness of what it means to be rich enough to just spend $70,000 to climb Everest and pay someone to get you there. And he talks about the Sherpas, and you can tell that he has a great deal of respect for the Sherpas in the region and the area. But then he'll say other things and you're like, that was the most privileged Western thing you could possibly say in this situation. And he's, you know, he has his areas of ignorance, we'll say, like, you know, because this is something he loves and wants to do, and it's bonkers that people kill themselves to accomplish this goal. And it's bonkers that, of course, it is complicated because Nepal depends on this industry for a revenue stream, but this book doesn't really go into that, is my point. Not really. Anyway, so there's that, where there's just moments where it lacks a certain perspective that I hope to glean, and that's not Davidson's or the book's fault, but also it has a pacing problem. Like, it dragged. I rarely have problems with nonfiction, especially disaster nonfiction. I like stuff like this where something wacky happened and you get a book by a survivor. This dragged at parts. He goes into such belabored blow-by-blow detail. Specifically, I think where it drags the most is actually the first half, which is the accounting of the earthquake and the avalanche. Because ultimately, especially when you compare it to the second half, really the last third, he does go back to Everest, real life spoiler, where he really takes you through, he's there for 6 weeks in order to summit. And you realize in hindsight that when the earthquake happened and the avalanche happened, he really hadn't been there that long. And yet that portion is longer than the part where you actually like get the last third's well paced. I was on the edge of my seat because, you know, you're climbing a mountain and people are dying. It's just like, we didn't need 10 pages about your hike to the top of this other thing for your dead friend. That's the thing. It's so terrible to say this. I did find it interesting, but every single section where he talks about he had an accident when he was younger, in the late 80s or early 90s, where a friend of his died. They were climbing together, and it changed his life and informed a lot of why he climbs. And that stuff was definitely interesting and definitely emotional. But every single time he talked about it, and every single time he had this awkward flashback chapter to his childhood, painting with his dad, trying to set up themes, they all dragged. They were too long, and I was like, I'm a little bored. And I was bored every time like, how many times do we need a blow by blow of going through the Khumbu ice ball? Because we did it like 8 times, because they do it when I guess I do now know, when you climb Everest, you do that like 8 times. You go up to base camp 1 and back down. You go up to base camp 2 and back down. And I knew that logically, but damn, he really takes you through it in excruciating detail. And I wish his editor had cut a lot of that. I basically wish this had a line edit to trim like 10,000 words specifically from the middle, because something as exciting as climbing Everest shouldn't drag like this. But look, it was fine. He's a good writer. He definitely had an interesting first-person perspective of something wacky that happened on Everest. As I said, the pacing in the last third, the excitement of like climbing, making it to the top was good. But still, you come away from it where the takeaway is, I'm so glad I neglected my family for long stretches of time over many, many years to climb mountains because I'm rich. And you just have to like go, huh. It's a hobby that could use a little bit of analysis, I suppose. It's just, especially when you think about like all these people going to Nepal and like, it's just interesting. So I have a book on hold at the library that I hope scratches that itch. This one really fell in the middle for me. I just have never had an instance where any Everest book dragged for me like this. Seriously, I read the Beck Weathers one. I read the one by Anatoly, the Russian, who was there in 1996. I've read other mountain books. I've watched all the documentaries, and this one just dragged at places. But yeah, regardless if you are also semi-fascinated by Everest, it's still an interesting book. I do feel that what I will take in the future to hopefully better paced books that have the social and political analysis that I am seeking, that now I definitely have the blow by blow in my head of how the heck you climb Everest, and I also know, no thanks, no thanks. No, I would not want to. It's no. So what an auspicious place to leave you. Those are the books that I read in September and into October. I'm just so glad that the reading is coming along. I'm reading one book that won't go to Wrapup because it's a CP book, but I'm reading another book for a blurb now, and I look forward to continuing to kind of push through my TBR. I still have to whittle my NetGalley queue way down, but now I'm like addicted to my library hold situation. I had never really gotten into ebooks for my library, which I know is really weird. But now I am, so we're just reading all the books. Let me know down below, did you read any of these? Some of these are old, you might have read them too. Always curious to see what you guys think about The Silent Patient. I just don't think I like the author very much, but oh well. And I'm definitely gonna pick up some better Christies in the future. As always, guys, give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I'm gonna make more reading wrap-ups anyway. If you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.